Contrast is another one of the principles of design. Contrast occurs when two elements are different. The greater the difference, the greater the contrast. The key to working with contrast is to make sure the differences are obvious. Four common methods of creating contrast are using differences in size, value, color, and type. Contrast adds interest to the page and provides a means of emphasizing what is important or directing the reader's eye. On a page without contrast, the reader doesn't know where to look first or what is important. Contrast makes a page more interesting so the reader is more apt to pay attention to what is on the page. Contrast aids in readability by making headlines and subheadings stand out. Contrast shows what's important by making smaller or lighter elements recede on the page to allow other elements to take center stage. So why use contrast? Well, the principle of contrast is one of the easiest, quickest ways to give your reader a visual treat and to draw attention to the page. The principle of contrast is used hand in hand with the principle of emphasis to keep elements on the page from looking too much alike and to pick up where the principle of emphasis stops on visually organizing the page. When everything on a page looks alike because of lack of emphasis and contrast, the page seems bland, it seems boring, and it lacks a clear organizational scheme. After all, if everything on a page looks about the same in importance, how would the viewer know which element is the most important? How would they know what to look at first, what to look at second, and so on? Contrast is automatic. As soon as you add any element to a blank page, you've used contrast. Using the example from the balance section, the page format is divided into white and black. Contrast was used to divide the format into two parts. Even before the dots and the lines were added, we basically had the benefit of using contrast, black against white. What would happen if one of the dots was twice as large as the others? By contrasting the size of the elements, the design moves into another dimension, and once again, the designer has another tool at his or her disposal. Contrast has endless possibilities. Try substituting a gray dot for a large black one. What impact does this have on the design? What about using a square instead of one of the dots? This simple example uses very plain shapes. When the subject matter is injected into these shapes, the dynamics of contrast becomes even more powerful. Contrast is one of the most important techniques to control a visual message. It is the sharpener of all meaning. As a powerful tool of expression, it intensifies the meaning. Any kind of visual contrast helps create emphasis. Contrast also adds dynamism to the design. In a simple composition, such as a portrait, the focal point is obvious. The more complicated the pattern, the more necessary or helpful a focal point may become in organizing the design. As a rule, a focal point results when one element differs from the others. Whatever interrupts an overall feeling or pattern automatically attracts the eye by this difference. When most elements are dark, a light form breaks the pattern and becomes the focal point. When most elements are vertical, a diagonal or horizontal element will be emphasized. When most elements are linear or geometric, a curvilinear or organic form will become the focal point. When most elements are pointed in one direction, the one that shows another direction will be the focal point. And when most elements are grouped in close proximity, the one that is isolated with space will be the focal point. The list can go on and on. This idea is called emphasis by contrast. As you can see in these examples here, we have contrast in value, dark and light. Here we have contrast in shape. We have rectangular, circular, and curved shapes here. Here we have contrast in scale, large and small. Here we have contrast in movement or direction. All of these are static and then one element is dynamic. And here we have contrast in space. One object is isolated from the group. So you can achieve contrast in a variety of ways. While design elements are most often used to support the content of the message, a powerful contrast can be provided with the use of contradiction. In these examples right here, the word big is set in type and fills the format. It lives up to its definition. When you set tiny in small type, over here, it kind of does the same thing. But what if you set the word big in small type, as shown here, and the word tiny in big type? Well, the contradiction implies a completely different concept, so you get different feelings from the text being sized differently. When using contrast to express an idea, entertain all of the possibilities. Contrast may be provided in size, color, shape, texture, typeface, and more. Think in terms of large and small, black and white, straight or crooked, perpendicular or angular, thick or thin, smooth or rough, dry or wet, shiny or dull, serif or sans serif, angular or rounded, organized or haphazard, center or off-centered. Carefully choose the combination that best represents the mood or idea you wish to communicate. Contrast that doesn't have the idea in mind can cloud a concept. Think about contrast in value and color. Does a gray on gray piece convey the same message as black on white? What about shapes to define tone or mood? Think of well-known shapes in history, like a German swastika, the hard edges and the spider-like, feeling that you get. Who can deny that the symbol communicates intensity? In contrast, think of the 1960s poster with the flower power theme. You instantly get a feeling of soft, carefree, flowing lines that embody the carefree attitude that prevailed during that era. Think of architecture. Contrasting materials used in buildings, like chrome against concrete. How many combinations of contrast can you spot in your day-to-day life? It's all around you. Contrast occurs when two or more elements look dramatically different from one another. Ways to achieve contrast include placing very small elements on the page with very large elements, such as small type and large type, or small images and large images, using all capital letters next to lowercase letters, or elaborate decorative type next to plain sans serif type, using thick type or lines with thin type, using warm colors or cool colors, using large areas of solid color pierced by a geometric textured shape. How about a vertical column of text broken by intruding strong horizontal elements like headlines or subheads, or even a solid line? What about black type and light gray type? Keep in mind that ways to achieve strong contrast is really to stress the difference between the visual elements. Do not do things by half measures. With contrast, it's often all or nothing. You can't be wishy-washy when you're using contrast. Contrast in typography. Typography affords the designer a great opportunity to use contrast. Look at any material with text. You'll see contrast at work. Larger headlines contrast with small subheads, photo captions and body copy. So do boldface and underlined letters and words. Use all uppercase letters to make headlines stand out. The difference between the normal and boldface and underlined or uppercase type is simply contrast. Contrast in size can be used to lead the viewer's eye, hence the use of large headlines and smaller body copy. In addition to contrasting typefaces, type sizes and widths of the text columns can also be contrasted. When you vary these, you vary the density of the type, which varies the color of the type, if you will. There's no rule telling you how many different typefaces you can use in a single layout, but until you get the feel for what is appropriate and what is not, it may be advisable to try to stick with just 2 or 3. When placing type in a format, ask yourself, what can you do with the type to strengthen your idea? Consider contrasting the type size, the type style, or weight of the type. You may try varying the leading or density. You may also try different type positions or column widths. When placing type within a format, ask yourself what you can do with the type to strengthen your idea. If you make body copy large for the sake of readability, it's fine, but at a certain size, determined only by experimentation, text can be too large and appear awkward and clunky. Think about how you can put space in between the characters. Think about the tracking and the kerning, even the spacing between the lines, the leading. All of these things will help to add contrast to your layout. There's almost always more than one way to illustrate a concept, even using the same elements. Here, there are 2 ways of illustrating the concept of captivity. The first conveys the meaning by placing the circles in the side of the square. And the second maybe is a little less obvious, but it shows that the 6 circles are being crowded into the corner of the format by the square. What you should consider when striving for contrast. Do the contrasts you've chosen to use for your design strengthen its idea? That's a really important thing to think about. Next, have you fully considered all the ways you might achieve contrast? Do you want to use contrast in value or color, shape, texture, typography? Consider everything. Think about your choices in contrast for typography. Are they suitable to the message of the design? Does the use of type make the piece more or less readable for your audience? Does it make it more or less visually appealing to your audience? Consider if you've pushed contrast to its most potent level. That is, if you're using large and small photographs, is there enough difference between the two sizes to show an obvious contrast? You don't want something to be almost missed. You want it to be extremely obvious. Also consider if the idea is diminished because of contrast. Not every successful design uses contrast as polar opposites. Sometimes subtlety can add strength to a design. Subtle color shifts, subtle differences in type, things like that. Let's look at a couple of examples. The first example that we're going to be looking at is this Valspar paint right here. This advertisement uses a strong contrast between the black and white upper portion and the lower portion of the violin, which is saturated with color. This sort of treatment really makes the color grab the viewer's eye, and it becomes the first thing that they see and focus on. Being that they're selling paint, it really is a great way to support the message. The design is basic and the idea is easy to understand. As with most powerful pieces, there's nothing in the design which distracts the viewer from the concept that the designer desired to communicate. The next ad we're going to look at is an ad for the iPod. This advertisement is clever and clean in its approach. The main visual is entirely made from their product. The tagline, which is hard to read but it says "Go Places," is reinforced by the headset curling into the motorcycle shape. Apple has made a series of these ads. One has a car and the other has an airplane, and this one has a motorcycle. But it's immediately obvious to use the ultimate contrast and value. Mostly pure black, and then the white is primarily used with maybe a little bit of silver or gray. The image is high quality and the product is actually depicted at actual size in the real ad. The emphasis is on the small size of the product, and it's shown with this vastness of space that is all around the format right here. Contrast is further achieved by placement of the element. Plenty of breathing room creates contrast and the visuals jump off the page. Sizing the product to actual size and giving it space is yet another successful choice. The product retains its real life size, demonstrating how small and convenient it is to use. The next ad is this Kia ad right here, and this uses contrast by making one item different from all the rest. The car, the soul, is shown amongst a grid of sheep. The viewer's eyes go right to the car since it's the only thing in the ad that's different. They choose to leave the rest of the ad clean and open, just adding their logo and the simple tagline, "The soul is a new way to roll." The choice of sheep was a good one since they really do emulate sameness and conformity. This further creates contrast, something fairly slow, quite often fluffy and just kind of benign, easily contrasts with their small, hip, fast, techie car that they're trying to showcase. And then the final example we're going to be looking at is this Alfa Romeo ad for their Moto. It's another car ad, and they've taken a different approach to their ad. This is a sexy and bold approach. The series of ads achieves contrast on many levels. The first series, of course, is the high impact color scheme, black, white, and red. The car and the logo are both shown in red, and they're the only items that really appear in color. The contrast, which is already contrasting black and white format, supports these images. The car is an actual photograph as opposed to the rest of the ad, which is primarily these line art drawings. This, along with sizing, is another use of contrast. The tagline for this series of ads is distinctly deviant, and actually this ad is the tamest of the bunch, if you will. They're all clean, sexy, and eye-catching. The straight lines of the triangle contrast with the curvy lines of the car, helping to focus attention. The triangular shape helps to lead the user's eye through the piece and successfully focus attention on the product shock. You can see how it kind of leads you up and down, and you always end up with the product right here. And all in all, this ad exemplifies contrast with every single element that it uses. In summary, contrast enhances our enjoyment of the differences in things around us. Design is merely an extension of everyday life that allows us to communicate visual concepts and ideas to each other. Contrast is a powerful design principle available to distinguish your message. Use contrast effectively. It can be a great element to add to your design.